Lecture 80, William Faulkner.
She is looking out the window at Cash stooping steadily at the board in the failing light, laboring on toward darkness and into it, as though the stroking of the saw illumined its own motion, board and saw engendered. "You, Cash!" she shouts, her voice harsh, strong, and unimpaired. "You, Cash!" He looks up at the gaunt face framed by the window in the twilight. It is a composite picture of all time since he was a child. He drops the saw and lifts the board for her to see, watching the window in which the face has not moved. He drags a second plank into position and slants the two of them into their final juxtaposition, gesturing toward the ones on the ground, shaping with his empty hand in pantomime the finished box. For a while, she looks down at him from the composite picture, neither with censure nor approbation. Then the face disappears. In this passage from William Faulkner's novel, As I Lay Dying, a dying woman named Addie Bundren, the I of the title, looks out the window of her isolated rural farmhouse to see her eldest son, Cash, carefully sawing the wooden planks for her coffin as the sun sets on a long, hot day in July and on her life. Beside her bed stands her husband, Ance, a toothless and hopelessly shiftless farmer who has promised his wife that he will bury her in the town of Jefferson, 20 miles off, where her relatives all lie. Shortly after this passage, Addie dies, and Cash works through the night in a driving rainstorm to finish building her coffin. He carries it into the house with the aid of his father, a neighbor named Vernon Tull, and a fat doctor named Peabody, who has been summoned far too late to help the dying woman. But even after they have put her into the coffin and nailed it shut, the family can't start their journey to Jefferson until two of Addie's other sons, Jewel and Darl, return from selling a wagon load of lumber. Because of a mishap on this trip and a series of further accidents and delays, the journey to Jefferson takes 9 days, with the body of Addie Bundren putrefying in the July heat before it is finally lowered into the ground. Since Addie tells her own story in just one chapter, this novel is chiefly the story of what her death reveals about the strange combination of characters who make up her family. By turns grotesque, tragic, and wildly comic, this novel is distinctively Faulknerian. In October of 1929, when Faulkner started writing As I Lay Dying, he was 32 years old, with 5 published novels to his credit. Born in New Albany, Mississippi in 1897, he was the eldest son of a railroad official who shortly moved his family to Oxford, managed various businesses there for his own father, and bought a livery stable. But Faulkner grew up with books as well as with horses. Though his father was a frustrated cowboy who doted on westerns, his mother Maud loved Shakespeare, fiction writers such as Balzac and Conrad, and poets such as Tennyson and Browning. She encouraged her children to read as well as to know something of their forebears. They included Colonel William C. Faulkner, who raised an infantry regiment for the Confederacy in the Civil War. The old colonel was killed in a duel nearly 8 years before the birth of his great-grandson, but the future novelist was named for him, and he soon enough learned that his ancestor had not only served as a corps commander in the Army of the Confederacy, but had also produced several novels, including The White Rose of Memphis, a mystery romance that proved a runaway success and stayed in print right up through young William's boyhood. By the age of 9, the boy knew just what he wanted to be when he grew up. "I want to be a writer," he would say, "just like my great-granddaddy." The grown-up Faulkner made no claims for his ancestors' melodramatic fiction. But from family stories, he eventually wove the figure of Colonel John Sartoris, legendary progenitor of the Sartoris line, a haunting presence in much of Faulkner's work. In the biographical sketch that he wrote for his very first published book, Faulkner identified himself as, first of all, the great-grandson of Colonel W.C. Faulkner. Faulkner found his way to fiction writing by a circuitous route. After quitting high school in December of his senior year, he re-entered the following September and soon quit again for good. He then worked briefly as a bank clerk, hung around the University of Mississippi, wrote verse in the manner of Housman and Swinburne, furnished drawings for the university yearbook, tried in vain to join the U.S. Army in the spring of 1918, and was then accepted by the Canadian Royal Air Force that summer when he was posted to Toronto. Discharged a few months later, he returned to Oxford, spent much of a year traveling to Memphis and New Orleans, published a poem in the New Republic, entered the University of Mississippi as a special student in September 1919, won a poetry prize in June, and withdrew in November, obviously allergic by now to formal education. But he never stopped writing. About 6 weeks after dropping out of the university, he submitted to the drama club 6 hand-lettered copies of a verse play, and the following summer he presented a manuscript volume of his poems to a young woman named Estelle Franklin, his childhood sweetheart, whom he would later marry himself. But first came more travel, more jobs, and publication of his first book. After spending the fall of 1921 in New York, where he worked as a clerk in a bookstore, he returned to Oxford to become postmaster at the university. A little less than 3 years later, Faulkner quit after numerous complaints that he had flagrantly neglected his duties and turned the post office into a bridge club. Asked how he felt about leaving, he said, "I reckon I'll be at the beck and call of folks with money all my life. But thank God I won't ever again have to be at the beck and call of every son of a bitch who's got 2 cents to buy a stamp." Stamps were a lot cheaper in 1924 than they are now. But in any case, Faulkner had good reason to feel liberated. He had already found a publisher for his first book, The Marble Faun, a collection of poems that appeared 6 weeks after he quit the post office in December 1924. Now 26, he decided to take his cue from one of his great-grandfather's last books, a set of travel sketches called Rapid Ramblings in Europe. But before sailing for Europe, he spent most of the winter and spring of 1925 in New Orleans, where he looked up Sherwood Anderson, the novelist. Anderson memorably describes his first encounter with Faulkner's ardent devotion to drink. When Faulkner arrived at the Sherwoods' apartment, he was wearing an overcoat so big and bulging that Anderson feared the man himself might be deformed. But it turned out that Faulkner was merely carrying 6 or 8 gallons of moon liquor brought from the country and stowed in the pockets of the big coat. We don't know just how long it took Faulkner to drink up all that moonshine, but we do know that he set sail in July of 1925 for Genoa. After briefly seeing Italy and Switzerland, he took a room in Paris on the left bank, and except for a week's trip to England in October, he stayed in Paris until early December when he returned to New Orleans. Now the fountain of his fiction started flowing into print. With the help of Sherwood Anderson, he found a publisher for his first novel, Soldier's Pay, which appeared in February 1926. Next came his second novel, Mosquitoes, in 1927. For his third novel, Sartoris, which came out early in 1929, he created the family of Sartoris and the fictional town of Jefferson, seat of the equally fictional region of Yoknapatawpha. According to Faulkner himself, Yoknapatawpha is a Chickasaw Indian word meaning water runs slow through flat land. Just as Thomas Hardy based the imaginary region of Wessex on the English county of Dorset, as we've seen, Faulkner based Jefferson and Yoknapatawpha on his native town of Oxford and the surrounding Lafayette County. Real in its origins, but recreated in Faulkner's fiction, Yoknapatawpha embodies a particular vision of the American South. It is neither the plantation South of novels such as Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind, nor the big city South of novels such as Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men. It's rather an isolated rural region where towns are small, where the pain and glory of the Civil War remain alive in memory, where idiosyncrasy can flourish, where irrational impulse may easily trump all logic, and where the sins of the fathers are invariably visited upon their sons and daughters. At the center of Yoknapatawpha, Faulkner placed the fictional family of Sartoris, the family that weaves its way through so much of his later work. In the novel called Sartoris, the chief character is Bayard Sartoris, a young man of 26 who has just returned from service with the British Royal Air Force in the First World War. Bayard cannot settle down. Buying a high-powered new car, he drives it at fanatical speed on country roads, terrifying pedestrians and wagon drivers. He gashes his head while trying to ride bareback on an untrained stallion. Flipping the car into a creek, he fractures his ribs. Resuming his reckless driving after his bones are mended, he plunges over a cliff, causing the death of his grandfather. And finally, after fleeing abruptly from home, he meets his end as a test pilot when he dies in the crash of a crackpot's experimental plane. Behind this sensational sequence of events lies something distinctively Faulknerian, a running counterpoint between past and present. Bayard Sartorus's hunger for violence and recklessness is part of his inheritance, a fever in the bloodline. Young Bayard returns to a house still haunted by the ghost of his great-grandfather, Colonel John Sartorus, and his great-great-uncle, also named Bayard Sartorus, who died in the Civil War. The memory of this man is kept alive by his sister Jenny, who never tires of telling with reverence how he gallantly gave his life at the age of 23. Acting on a chance word from General Jeb Stuart, he was killed while trying to steal anchovies from a federal encampment. The burlesque twist here typifies Faulkner's humor. Like Mark Twain, he undercuts the glamour of self-sacrifice, even while seeming to idealize it. Faulkner draws still more humor from Old Man Falls, an impoverished nonagenarian who endlessly talks about Colonel John Sartorus. Besides recounting the colonel's exploits in the Civil War, he reports that the colonel one day calmly shot 2 Yankee carpetbaggers who had tried to gain voting rights for Negroes. He also tells how the colonel died. One evening, without apparent provocation, he was shot to death in Jefferson's public square. So young Bayard inherits a family tradition made up of violence, aristocratic grandeur, and reckless heroism. In a time of peace, he strives to maintain this tradition in the only way he knows, by daredevil driving and riding. In fact, even though his Aunt Jenny and old Bayard repeatedly warn him against speeding, his wild driving becomes a kind of heroism in the eyes of Narcissa Benbow, the frail, quiet young lady who marries him. For a time, she stabilizes him. She makes him promise to give up his reckless driving. But for all her delicacy, she herself brings to the marriage a trace of foulness, a batch of letters, unsigned, semi-literate, and indecent, a batch of letters sent to her by a man named Byron Snopes. Though his first name ironically evokes the great English romantic poet, his surname in the later novels comes to signify crass rootlessness, the antithesis of an aristocratic lineage. Also taking their place in this complex world of violence, lust, and old aristocratic elegance are the men and women of color who so often populate Faulkner's work. Faulkner's portrayal of Simon is particularly deft, witty, and poignant. Early in the novel, this garrulous old servant of the Sartorus family comes in a horse-drawn carriage to collect young Bayard's grandfather, old Bayard, president of the local bank. Filled with a sense of his own importance as chauffeur for the grandest family in town, he gives a kind of theatrical majesty to the departure of the carriage with the master inside. But Simon, it turns out, has misappropriated the money entrusted to him by elders of the local black church. Though he claims to have lost the funds in a bad investment and manages to get old Bayard to pay off the elders, he has actually used the money to keep a young mistress. When his battered dead body is one day found in her cabin, he becomes a lesser victim of the violence that permeates the book. Yet the violence does not conquer all. Even though young Bayard's death seems to finish off the Sartorus line, the almost simultaneous birth of his child ends the novel on a typically Faulknerian note of ambiguity. The final scene seems peaceful, with Narcissa softly and gently playing the piano for Aunt Jenny on a calm and windless night. But the ghosts of past generations still linger in the house, and through its hallways and chambers we continue to hear the dark whisperings of disaster and fatality that have always intermingled themselves with the legendary glamour of the Sartorus name. In June of 1929, 5 months after Sartorus appeared, Faulkner married the newly divorced Estelle Franklin, and by September they were settled in Oxford. Early in the next month came publication of his 4th novel, The Sound and the Fury, which drew several admiring reviews and one unequivocally canonizing verdict from Lyle Saxon in the Herald Tribune. Quote, "I believe simply and sincerely," he wrote, "that this is a great book." But like Faulkner's first three novels, this new book found precious few takers. In over a year, it sold fewer than 2,000 copies. As a result, Faulkner needed a regular job, and he found one at the power station of the University of Mississippi, where he went to work on the 12-hour night shift from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. Just imagine. Shoveling coal into a wheelbarrow and wheeling it up to the boiler was a laborious job. But when Faulkner discovered that he had nothing to do from about midnight to 4 a.m., he decided to write during those hours. And so, starting on October 25, the day after the great Wall Street crash of '29, he spent just over 6 weeks writing As I Lay Dying. He finished it in record time because he knew beforehand just exactly where he was headed. I set out deliberately, he said, to write a tour de force. Before I ever put pen to paper and set down the first word, I knew what the last word would be. Before I began, I said I am going to write a book by which, at a pinch, I can stand or fall if I never touch ink again. Those are brave words. But Faulkner knew he had set himself a daunting challenge and met it. Just imagine this book as the answer to an assignment in a creative writing class. Write a novel in which the central figure is a corpse, traveling to a burial ground on a journey menaced by fire and flood, and narrated from 15 different points of view, including that of the corpse itself. Talk about an impossible task, but this is the task that Faulkner assigns to himself. In telling his story from multiple viewpoints and with a variety of narrators, Faulkner reflects the influence of James Joyce's Ulysses, a book he greatly admired. For some chapters of Ulysses, Joyce creates quite distinctive narrators with severely limited points of view. And in chapters with omniscient narrators, he sometimes enters a character's head to give you every thought and feeling that passes through it in the character's own words, a technique that has been called stream of consciousness. This technique exemplifies modernism, which, as we've already seen, spotlights the radical subjectivity of the isolated self, the self cut off from social regulation, traditional values, and traditional constraint, conventional constraint, the self speaking only for itself and its own point of view. Faulkner's novel accentuates this condition in a new way. Rather than using separate narratives for just some of the characters or embedding stream of consciousness passages within a framework of omniscient narration, as Joyce does, Faulkner makes his characters do all the storytelling from their mutually exclusive points of view. Paradoxically, these characters are a tight-knit bunch of loners. Though nearly all of them are bound together by their ties to Addie Bundren, they are radically sundered from one another by the isolation of their viewpoints, as each one tells his or her own piece of the story. The only character in this novel who can understand what anyone else may be thinking or feeling is the character named Darl, who is finally consigned to a lunatic asylum. Besides reflecting the influence of Ulysses, Faulkner's novel takes its title from Joyce's prime source, Homer's Odyssey. In Book 11 of the Odyssey, where the hero visits the realm of the dead, the shade of Agamemnon says to Odysseus, "As I lay dying, the woman with the dog's eyes would not close my eyelids for me as I descended into Hades." The woman is his wife Clytemnestra, who conspired with her lover to kill Agamemnon as soon as he returned from the Trojan War. In saying that she would not close his eyes as he descended to the realm of the dead, Agamemnon accuses his wife of dishonoring his corpse as well as of cuckolding and murdering him. Paradoxically, the counterpart of Agamemnon in Faulkner's novel is not a betrayed husband, but an adulterous wife, Addie Bundren. She speaks to us only once in the novel, in a long chapter that comes near the end, long after she has died. In Edgar Lee Masters' Spoon River Anthology, a book of more than 200 poems that was published in 1915 and that Faulkner certainly knew, various dead characters speak from a graveyard on an Illinois hillside. But in Faulkner's novel, Addie stands out as the only dead character who speaks. From her posthumous soliloquy, we learn that her life with ants was so intolerably dull, she took a lover, a preacher named Whitfield, whom she periodically met in the woods and by whom she had a child, Jewel. Addie thus calls to mind Hester Prynne of Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. She too takes a preacher for a lover, meets him in the woods, and has a child by him, whom she calls Pearl. But to set Addie beside Hester Prynne, or Clytemnestra, is also to see how much he differs from them both. Instead of killing her husband, as Clytemnestra did, Addie discovered one day that he was already dead, emotionally dead, without knowing it. So she sins just to keep herself alive, to do her duty, quote, to the terrible bitter blood, the red bitter blood boiling through the land, unquote. Given her sense of duty to life itself, no Puritan conscience can punish Addie as it once punished Hester Prynne. Though she claims to have hid nothing, she never wore anything like a scarlet A, and to her lover's immense relief, their secret dies with her. Addie dies with no regrets. Besides Jewel, she had 4 children by aunts, 3 boys and a girl. Having borne these children, she felt ready to die, for she lived by the despairing words of her father, who told her that, quote, the reason for living was to get ready to stay dead a long time. She took these words to heart. Even though all of her relatives were dead and buried in Jefferson before she married aunts, she wished to rejoin them at the end of her own life, so she made aunts promise to take her back to Jefferson when she died. Ironically, it is precisely aunts' stubborn determination to keep this promise that leads to the dishonoring of her corpse. Asked to name the villain of this story, Faulkner himself said that she could have been buried where she was. Quote, so if there was a villain, it was the convention, which gave them no out except to carry her through fire and flood 20 miles in order to follow the dying wish, which by that time meant nothing, unquote. Fire and flood are apocalyptic forces, of course, and Faulkner has also said, with disarming simplicity, that in this novel he subjected the Bundren family, quote, to the 2 greatest catastrophes which man can suffer, fire and flood. That's all. But as Cash perceives, either of these catastrophes might have decently disposed of Addie's corpse and thus spared it the indignity of being further dragged along. According to the Bible, the earth was long ago struck with a deluge, and sometime in the future the whole universe will be consumed by fire. In a concentrated version of these events, the Bundren family braves both water and fire. First, with Addie's coffin perched on a wagon drawn by a mule team, they make their way through a driving rainstorm to the bank of a river. After finding 2 bridges washed out, they try to ford the river, but with the wagon nearly across, a floating log comes along to overturn it. As a result, the mules are drowned and Cash's leg is broken. But almost single-handedly, Jewel drags both the wagon and the coffin up the riverbank. Later, when fire threatens the coffin, he surpasses this feat. On their last stop before Jefferson, the family stays with a Mr. Gillespie, who lets them leave the coffin in the barn. When Darl sets the barn on fire, Jewel rescues the coffin by sliding it off the sawhorses and turning it end over end, getting his back burned in the process. Like so much else that happens in this novel, Jewel's actions are at once heroic and deeply ironic. While he saves his mother's corpse from both the fire and the flood, he topples her decomposing body in the process and preserves it only to rot for yet another day beneath a steady circling of buzzards. As Cash observes, I thought more than once before we crossed the river and after how it would be God's blessing if he did take her out in our hands and get shut of her in some clean way. And it seemed to me that when Jewel worked so hard to get her out in the river, he was going against God in a way. And then when Darl seen that it looked like one of us would have to do something, I can almost believe he done right in a way. Cash stops just short of fully approving what Darl has done, and in the end he agrees that Darl must be institutionalized. But Cash also sees that each of his brothers has tried to do something for their mother, however much they misunderstand, mistrust, or resent each other. Cash himself built her coffin, which infuriates Jewel, who feels that his mother belongs only to him. It's because he stays out there, right under the window, hammering and sawing on that goddamn box, where she's got to see him, where every breath she draws is full of his knocking and sawing, where she can see him saying, "See, see what a good one I am making for you." I told him to go somewhere else. I said, "Good God, do you want to see her in it?" In the eyes of Jewel, Cash is utterly heartless. But Cash looks very different to Darl, who strangely combines a growing insanity with an astonishing empathy. He understands each of his siblings almost better than they understand themselves. Darl has the insight of a poet, and he knows that the coffin is the work of a conscientious carpenter. With its soft gold boards carefully beveled and fitted together, the coffin is something like a work of art, a fitting last gift from a son to his mother. Addie Bundren, says Darl to himself, could not want a better one, a better box to lie in. It will give her confidence and comfort. Addie's comfort in the box is precisely what concerns her youngest son, Vardaman, a boy who has his own quite distinctive ideas about her death. Since she dies shortly after the arrival of the doctor, he thinks the doctor has killed her, and in rage he drives away the doctor's horses. Also, Vardaman believes that his mother must go on breathing, and he cannot bear the idea that she is nailed up inside a box. So right after she's nailed up in it, he drills the lid full of holes. And when the lid is taken off, it turns out the 2 holes have been drilled right into Addie Bundren's face. You may find this grotesque, horrible, ridiculous, or all 3. But like so much else that happens in this novel, it is also touchingly human. In their own idiosyncratic and often mutually contradictory ways, each of Addie Bundren's 4 sons tries to do something for her as she dies. The same is true of her only daughter, Dewey Dell, who stands at her bed ceaselessly fanning her in the opening chapters. But Dewey Dell really wants just one thing, an abortion. 2 months pregnant by a farmhand named Leif, she feels desperate, like a wet seed wild in the hot, blind earth. The doctor, she thinks, could do everything for me if he just noted. But since Dewey Dell can't bring herself to tell the doctor about her pregnancy, she pins her hopes on the $10 that Leif has given her. With that, she believes, she can buy at a drugstore something that will solve her problem, and that is why she wants to go to Jefferson. A quite different motive drives her father. For 15 years, he's had nothing but gums in his mouth, not a single tooth. Consequently, quite aside from his dogged determination to take his dead wife to Jefferson, as he promised her, he wants to buy himself a set of false teeth. Nothing better illustrates the deadness of his feelings for Addie than his reaction to her death. After feebly trying to smooth the quilt over her body, he says simply, "God's will be done. Now I can get them teeth." So this novel is the story of a family united by little more than one man's determination to get from one place to another with the body of his wife in tow. To keep his promise to her, Ance dishonors her body, letting it putrefy for days on end rather than burying it anywhere but in Jefferson. Also, because he always counts on other people to bail him out, he makes his children pay the price for the disasters that occur on this trip. To replace the mules that drown in the river, Ance trades away Jewel's prized possession, his horse. To fix the leg that Cash breaks in the river crossing, Ance has it set in cement, which ruins the leg and leaves Cash a cripple. Darl and Dewey Dell fare no better. Darl is packed off to a lunatic asylum, and instead of getting an abortion, Dewey is deceived by a drugstore clerk who tells her that she can solve her problem by having sex with him. "It ain't going to work," she says ruefully afterwards. "That son of a bitch." The only one who gains from the trip is Ance Bundren. While stopping at a house in Jefferson to borrow a spade for the digging of Addie's grave, he spends considerable time with a woman inside while his children wait outside, listening to the sounds of a record player coming from the house. After the burial, Ance gets himself shaved and groomed, disappears for a time, and returns with a new set of teeth, hangdog and proud at the same time, with a pop-eyed, duck-shaped woman behind him, carrying a little record player. After telling this woman the names of all his children, he presents her to them. "Meet Mrs. Bundren," he says. Ance Bundren knows how to pay himself off. Having made his children drag a putrefying corpse on a 9 days' journey to burial in Jefferson, and having thus kept his promise to his dead wife, he has now not only gratified his craving for a set of teeth, he has also replaced his wife. These are the forms that renewal takes at the end of this novel. If the family has come through fire and flood to reach the end of its pilgrimage, what they achieve is a parody of regeneration. For only Ants comes away with a new lease on life, and its terms are at once comic and brutal. The pop-eyed, duck-shaped woman could have popped right out of an animated cartoon. But with his very last words, Ants brutally erases all memory of the first Mrs. Bundren. Together with the deep pathos underlying it, the bitter comedy of this ending exemplifies the power of William Faulkner's work.